I'm delighted to announce that history makers Babs Wingo, Ethel Johnson, and Marva Scott, three African-American women, three biological sisters, who were the first to integrate pro wrestling in the 1950s in the United States, are being honored by the inaugural class, the class of 2023, of the new Women's Wrestling Hall of Fame. Big shout out to my friend Christopher Anino for making this happen. And in honor of these ladies, this video will contain content that celebrates them. First up, a clip from Lady Wrestler that explains how Babs Wingo was the first Black woman to participate in an interracial championship with world champion Mildred Burke in the 50s, and Mildred is also in the inaugural class of the Women's Wrestling Hall of Fame. I'm also including a segment from the Lady Wrestler podcast, The Story Behind the Story, which I released upon the debut of the Lady Wrestler documentary on Amazon Prime Video during Black History Month in 2021. This segment was produced when it was announced that Ethel Johnson was being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And last and certainly not least is a profile I did of Marva Scott, the youngest sister, on my YouTube channel. And in the description box to this video, I'll include links to the Women's Wrestling Hall of Fame, an article in Slam Wrestling. Shout out to Greg Oliver for writing this awesome article announcing the Women's Wrestling Hall of Fame and the inductees. And I'll also include the link to watch Lady Wrestler on Amazon Prime Video. You can rent it or buy it. Congratulations to these wonderful ladies and their families, and I hope you enjoy these tributes. Babs and Ethel soon distinguished themselves from the pack. In 1953, Babs wrestled World Wrestling Champion Mildred Burke before a crowd of nearly 9,000 fans in Kansas City in what was billed as the first interracial championship.
This was after school. I would go up there and spend 3 hours in the gym, and that was, God, I must have been starting around 12. But most everybody else was adults, you know. So, except my sister, because she was only 16 too.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. This podcast gives you an exclusive behind-the-scenes look at the documentary Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring. The documentary chronicles the accomplishments of Black women who broke racial and gender boundaries in the male-dominated wrestling business in the mid-20th century. I'm Chris Bournet, and I directed the documentary. That voice you heard at the beginning of the podcast was an interview clip from Lady Wrestler with the legendary Ethel Johnson talking about when she first got into wrestling as a preteen. Ms. Johnson was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame on April 6, 2021, alongside Pistol Pez Whatley, Dick the Bruiser, Buzz Bulldog Sawyer, and Paul Besh. This is a special edition of the Lady Wrestler podcast dedicated to Ethel Johnson in observance of this long overdue honor. Throughout her life, from her birth on May 14, 1935, to her passing on September 14, 2018, Ms. Johnson was a phenomenal woman who blazed trails as one of the first African-American women to integrate pro wrestling in the 1950s. But she always put family first. Family, in fact, was always front and center in Ms. Johnson's life. She entered the wrestling business with her older sister, Babs Wingo, and younger sister, Marva Scott, who went on to become legends in their own right. Babs, Ethel, and Marva were to pro wrestling what Jackie Robinson was to Major League Baseball, innovators who triumphed over racism and segregation to prove that African Americans can excel in any arena. Ms. Johnson was a devoted wife to Leon Hairston, who passed away in 2010, and she was a doting, attentive mother to daughters Shelley Adams, Pamela Coleman, and Nina Whitehead, and son Leon Jr. She was a grandmother of 7 and a great-grandmother of 7. The WWE Hall of Fame induction was certainly not the first accolade that Ms. Johnson received during her career, which spanned the 1950s, 60s, and 70s until her retirement in 1976. Wrestling publications and newspapers of the day described her as the Negro Venus of wrestling. One newspaper article heralded, "Boston calls her a hurricane," describing how she blew into the capital city of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for a wrestling match and promptly proceeded to blow everyone away with her thunderous skills in the ring. "Ebony Beauty has skill and ferocity," reads the headline of an article in another wrestling magazine from the 1950s. The article, penned by Earl F. Yetter, describes how it was inevitable that Ms. Johnson would soon become a world champion. The article states, "Flashing across the wrestling horizon like an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, in recent months is the imposing figure of Ethel Johnson, who has the distinction of being among the first Negro girls booked as a wrestler. So great have been her performances that she is a serious threat to the World Championship. Experts agree that she is capable of holding her own with any woman rival. She has become regarded as one of the greatest of her race to enter professional sports, and it appears that nothing is going to stand in the way of this girl achieving her life's ambition." While I certainly agree with the article's glowing description of Ms. Johnson, I take exception with one detail. The article proclaims, "Experts agree that she is capable of holding her own with any woman rival." I disagree. Ms. Johnson was capable of holding her own with any rival, period. Thank you, Ms. Johnson, for all that you and your sisters, Babs Wingo and Marva Scott, and fearless African-American women like you did to pave the way for female athletes everywhere, and the rich legacy you left for generations to come. Thank you for listening, and please join us next week for the next regularly scheduled episode of Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. In that episode, we'll explore how Ms. Johnson's hometown, the mid-sized Midwestern city, Columbus, Ohio, became the birthplace of the golden age of women's wrestling, and how the city nurtured the talents of legends like Ethel Johnson, Babs Wingo, and Marva Scott. I'll leave you with another quote from Ms. Johnson about the moment she knew when she was worthy of the title World Champion.
Like, I was glad when finally they could call me Miss Johnson instead of Ethel Johnson, you know. They had to say that because I proved myself as number one in the country. Number one.
In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Columbus, Ohio native Marva Scott gained an international reputation as one of the most feared bad guys in professional wrestling. But of course, she wasn't a guy at all. Along with her older sisters Babs Wingo and Ethel Johnson, Marva Scott was a trailblazing African-American lady wrestler, as they were called back in the day. You can learn more about Marva's story when the new documentary that I directed, Lady Wrestler, The Amazing Untold Story of African American Women in the Ring, is released this fall on DVD and streaming services. In this video, I'll give you a quick overview of Marva's story and how she balanced traveling all over the world, taking on opponents in faraway places like Tokyo, Japan, and Sydney, Australia, with being a single mother. Upon following her big sisters Babs and Ethel into wrestling, Marva soon established her own reputation and became an in-demand opponent and tag team partner. She had a tremendous work ethic. Marva and Babs both passed away in 2003, so I didn't get an opportunity to meet them. But I did have the honor of interviewing Ethel, as well as Marva's daughter, Kim Martin, her son James Black, and her grandson, James Black Jr. In this clip from the documentary, Kim and James describe how they would help their mother train for her matches around the world.
She had to be physically fit. She would ride her bike, ride my brother's bike, you know, do cartwheels. My mother was serious about, you know, when she would wrestle, was serious because she wouldn't want to be hurt by doing something wrong. So when people ask, is it real? Yeah, you can really be hurt. You really can. So everything has to be in order.
In preparing for the ring, Marva enlisted the help of her children, as her son Jimmy recalls.
But she did used to work out on me quite a bit down in the basement. She used to work me over. Wow. Like I said, I was all over that basement flying.
If you like this video, please leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to my channel.